Margaret Scott stood alone at her husband's grave, the weight of shame and grief crushing her heart. Tucker Scott had died in disgrace. A police officer branded as corrupt by his own department, denied even the honor of being buried in his uniform. But as Margaret visited the cemetery that day, a mysterious little girl in a yellow dress appeared between the headstones. What this child was about to reveal would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about her husband's death and transform her life forever. But who was this mysterious little girl that showed up at her husband's grave? And what did she tell Margaret that would turn her world upside down? Before we dive into this gripping story that will send shivers down your spine, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The summer sun hung high in the sky, casting long, stark shadows across Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, barely enough to dry the tears that streaked Margaret's face as she stood over Tucker's half-open coffin. The dark casket contrasted sharply with the brightness of the day, a stark reminder of the finality of death. With trembling hands, Margaret reached out to tidy the collar of Tucker's lifeless form. Her fingers, pale and slender, brushed against his darker skin as she tenderly adjusted the fabric. It was a small gesture, one that she had performed countless times during their life together, but now it felt hollow, devoid of the warmth and love that had once accompanied it. The priest, clad in somber black and purple vestments, stepped forward. His eyes were kind but insistent as he whispered, "It's time, Mrs. Scott. We need to close the coffin now." Margaret nodded, fighting back the sobs that threatened to consume her. She took one last look at her husband's face, memorizing every line and contour. "They won't even let you be buried in your uniform," she muttered, her voice thick with grief. The words hung in the air, a painful reminder of the police department's rejection of any honors for Tucker. Margaret leaned in close, her lips almost touching Tucker's ear. "Are you with the good Lord now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you break your vow? Did you hurt that girl?" The unanswered questions hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The priest looked down, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of Tucker's tarnished name loomed over the service, an unspoken presence that seemed to suffocate the very air around them. Margaret straightened up, her eyes meeting the priest's. "No one else is coming," she confirmed, her voice hollow. "My children. They believe Tucker died a criminal." The priest nodded solemnly, his hand coming to rest on Margaret's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. But Margaret barely felt it. Her world had narrowed to this moment, to the sight of her husband's body being sealed away forever. As the coffin closed with a soft thud, Margaret felt a piece of her heart being locked away with it. The cemetery around her seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves muted as if in respect for the somber occasion. Margaret's gaze swept across the rows of headstones, each one a testament to lives lived and lost. And now Tucker would join their ranks, his name etched in stone for eternity. The casket descended, Margaret's grip on the photograph tightened. Her thumb brushed over Tucker's face, as if trying to reach through the glass and touch him one last time. The wind shifted, carrying the priest's words away, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The mechanical whir of the lowering device seemed to echo the finality of the moment. Each inch the casket descended felt like a physical pain in Margaret's chest. She watched, her eyes never leaving the dark wood as it disappeared into the earth. When at last the casket came to rest at the bottom of the grave, the priest concluded his prayers. He excused himself, leaving Margaret alone at the graveside. "See Tucker," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No colleagues, no family but me. They think you are guilty. All of them except me." Her voice broke on the last word, and she had to take a moment to compose herself before continuing. "Robert said you tried to kill that girl, did you?" The unyielding stone provided no solace, only cold silence. Margaret reached out, her fingers tracing the letters of Tucker's name etched into the granite. Each curve and line felt like a piece of her heart breaking anew. Even the sight of the tombstone itself brought fresh pain, The department had refused to provide a proper headstone for one of their own. Instead, she'd been forced to settle for a second-hand stone, its weathered surface a final indignity to Tucker's memory. Each imperfection, each crack and stain in the old granite seemed to mock the years he'd given in service. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw the cemetery caretaker walking towards her. His weathered face was etched with concern as he came to a stop a respectful distance away. "There's a cafe nearby, ma'am, just across the road if you need to rest," he offered, his voice tinged with genuine worry. "It's mighty hot out here." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how parched her throat felt and how the heat seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. She struggled to her feet, her legs stiff from kneeling for so long. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. "I'm Margaret Scott, by the way." The caretaker nodded, a small sympathetic smile on his face. "Obed Johnson, ma'am. I'm the caretaker here at Holy Sepulchre. I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret appreciated his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think I will take your advice about that cafe." Obed nodded. "It's just across the street. Take all the time you need, Mrs. Scott. The cemetery will be open for a while yet." With a final glance at Tucker's grave, Margaret turned to leave. "I'll be back," she whispered, a promise to both Tucker and herself. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The questions that had plagued her throughout the funeral still burned in her mind, unanswered and relentless. Margaret's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as she slowly made her way through the cemetery. The sun bore down relentlessly, its heat seeming to sap the very life from the air around her. She walked with her head bowed, lost in thought, barely registering the whisper of nearby leaves hinting at movement. Suddenly she paused. A prickle ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her heart quickened its pace as she stood there, frozen in place. The moment stretched on, becoming almost unbearable in its intensity. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Margaret half-turned, her eyes scanning the area around her. But there was nothing to see, just swaying branches and silent headstones. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Tucker, you always loved surprises," she murmured, forcing a chuckle that quickly dissolved into a sigh. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the sensation. It must be the caretaker making his rounds, she decided, or perhaps just her grief-addled mind playing tricks on her. Continuing on her way, Margaret finally reached her car. As she approached, something caught her eye. There, tucked under the windshield wiper, was an envelope. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she reached for it. The paper was creased into an intricate origami-like shape. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she carefully unfolded it. As she did so, something small and glittering tumbled out, landing in her lap. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized it immediately. A ruby earring, its luster slightly dulled by time. It was Tucker's first anniversary gift to her, a piece of jewelry she had treasured for years, but had eventually misplaced. With shaking fingers, Margaret retrieved the note from inside the envelope. The message, scrawled in broken grammar, read simply, "Grief with you." Margaret's thoughts spun with questions. Who knew of her earring? Who had left this note? And how did this individual come to have one of the pair? She looked around, half expecting to see someone watching her, but the parking lot was deserted. The only movement came from the heat waves shimmering off the asphalt. Margaret clutched the earring tightly in her hand, feeling its familiar weight and shape. It was a tangible link to Tucker, to happier times when their love was uncomplicated by doubt and suspicion. As she stood there, the sun beating down on her, Margaret felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. There was confusion, certainly, and a touch of fear at the unknown. But there was also a spark of something else. Hope, perhaps. Hope that there was more to Tucker's story than she knew, that there were answers out there waiting to be found. With a deep breath, Margaret carefully tucked the ruby jewelry and note into her purse. She cast one last glance around the cemetery before getting into her car. As she started the engine, She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger than she could imagine. The cemetery receded in her rearview mirror as she drove away. But the questions raised by the mysterious gift lingered until Margaret's car pulled into the small parking lot across from Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. The cafe stood there, a modest building with a weathered sign that read, Rosie's Place. It looked like it had been there for decades, a constant presence amid the ebb and flow of life and death just across the street. As she stepped out of her car, the heat hit her like a wall. The short walk from the parking lot to the cafe's entrance left her feeling drained, her black morning dress clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The cool rush of air-conditioned air that greeted her as she pushed open the door was a blessed relief. Inside, the cafe was a haven of calm. The air carried the comforting scents of brewed coffee and freshly baked bread. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, their hushed conversations creating a soft background murmur. Margaret made her way to a corner booth, sliding onto the vinyl seat with a soft sigh. Her fingers found their way into her purse, brushing against the ruby earring. She pulled it out, turning it over in her hands, as she waited for the waitress to approach. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and greying hair, tied back in a neat bun, soon appeared at her table. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice warm and sympathetic. She'd clearly seen her fair share of grieving customers over the years. "Iced tea, please, no sugar," Margaret replied, her voice sounding hoarse even to her ears. "And some scones if you have them." She paused, then added, "And could I get a takeaway order of a grilled cheese sandwich and coffee?" The waitress nodded, jotting down the order. "Of course, dear. I'll have that right out for you." As the waitress walked away, Margaret's attention returned to the earring. She held it up to the light, watching as it caught and refracted the cafe's warm glow. Her mind drifted back to the day Tucker had given it to her, their first wedding anniversary. His smile had been so bright, so full of love and promise for their future together. Now, all these years later, that future had been cut short, and instead of cherishing their memories together, Margaret found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband. The handwriting on the note nagged at her. It was shaky and childlike, nothing like Tucker's bold, confident script. Who would know to return this to her now? And why? Her musings were interrupted by the return of the waitress, bearing a tray with her tea and scones. "Here you go, hun," she said, setting everything down carefully. "Your takeaway order will be ready in a few minutes." Margaret nodded her thanks, wrapping her hands around the teacup. The cold condensation seeped into her palms, grounding her in the present moment. As she sipped her tea and nibbled at a scone, Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Could the earring be a message from beyond? A sign that Tucker was trying to communicate with her? Or was it something more earthly, more sinister? The cafe's peaceful atmosphere seemed at odds with the turmoil in Margaret's heart. She found herself studying the other patrons, wondering if any of them could be the mysterious note-leaver. But each face she saw was unfamiliar, offering no answers to her questions. When the waitress brought her takeaway order, Margaret reached a decision. She would go back to the cemetery, and soon. Maybe the person who left this was still there. Something within her suggested that the answers she needed could be found among the silent stones and whispering trees. Gathering her things, Margaret left a generous tip on the table and headed for the door. The heat outside was still oppressive, but she barely noticed it now. Her mind was focused on one thing: finding the truth about Tucker, no matter where it might lead her. The sun blazed at its full strength as Margaret made her way back through the gates of Holy Sepulchre Cemetery. The gravel crunched beneath her feet, a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the beating of her heart. In one hand, she clutched the takeaway bag from the cafe. In the other, she held tightly to her purse, feeling the weight of the ruby earring within. As she approached Tucker's grave, the freshly turned earth was a stark reminder of how recent her loss was. The headstone, newly placed, gleamed in the harsh sunlight. Margaret lowered herself to the ground, not caring about the dirt that would surely stain her dress. "I'm back, Tucker," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I brought you something." With careful movements, Margaret opened the takeaway container. The aroma of the grilled cheese sandwich, Tucker's favorite, wafted up, bringing with it a flood of memories. How many times had she made this exact meal for him over the years? She placed the sandwich on top of the grave, then unscrewed the lid of the coffee thermos. Slowly, reverently, she poured the dark liquid over the freshly turned soil. "A little offering for you, my love," she said, her voice catching. "I hope wherever you are you can enjoy it." As she set the empty thermos aside, something caught her eye. There, atop the gravestone, was a glint of red. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she reached out to investigate. Her fingers curled around a familiar shape, another ruby earring, the pair to the one she had discovered on her car. She held it up, watching as it caught the sunlight and cast tiny sparks of crimson fire. The appearance of the second earring confirmed what Margaret had begun to suspect. Someone was watching her, someone connected to Tucker. But who? Was this a threat? Maybe they were right and someone was trying to take revenge by hurting his family. A noise from behind startled her out of her thoughts. Margaret turned, her eyes scanning the surrounding area. And there, peeking out from behind a nearby tree, was a little black girl, not more than 10 years old. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, a moment of connection that seemed to stretch into eternity. But before Margaret could say anything, could even fully process what she was seeing, the girl turned and ran. "Wait!" Margaret called out, struggling to her feet, but her cry was drowned out by a much louder voice. "Hey, you there!" It was Obed, the cemetery caretaker, his face red with exertion as he shouted after the fleeing girl. "I've told you before, if I see you around here again, I'm calling the police." The girl disappeared from view, the echo of her footsteps fading away. Obed approached Margaret, shaking his head. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "That girl's been hanging around since last night. Spooked the hell out of me when I was making my rounds." Margaret's mind was reeling. "Have you seen her near my husband's grave before?" she asked. "While I was away?" The caretaker shook his head. "Can't say that I have. Haven't seen anyone else visit either, come to think of it." He looked at Margaret curiously. "Do you know who she is?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the girl had vanished. "No," she said softly. "No, I don't." Obed excused himself, leaving Margaret alone once more with her thoughts. She quickly finished what remained of her own lunch, barely tasting it. The sun was high in the sky now, scorching the grass beneath her feet. Margaret found herself alone once more at Tucker's grave. The cemetery seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive midday sun casting sharp shadows across the grounds. She took a final bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly as she gathered her emotions. The weight of the day's revelations pressed heavily upon her as she prepared to return to her car. Just as she was about to stand, a movement caught her eye. Margaret looked up and spotted a familiar figure walking towards her. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Danny, Tucker's former partner in the police department. Dressed in casual clothes rather than his uniform, his approach sent a jolt of both surprise and unease through her. "Margaret," Danny said with a small nod as he reached the grave, his voice carrying a weight of shared sorrow. His eyes, usually bright and full of humor, were clouded with grief. "Danny," she replied, a hint of hope veiled by caution. She stood up, instinctively reaching out to grasp his hand. The years and shared grief between them seemed to thrum in the silence that followed. Danny squeezed her hand before letting go, his gaze falling to the headstone. "I can't believe he's gone," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Remember how he always said he'd outlive us all?" Margaret couldn't help but smile at the memory. "Because he was too stubborn to die," she finished, her voice wavering slightly. Danny nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering across his face. "That's our Tucker." He stood by the headstone, his eyes fixed on Tucker's name etched into the cool stone. "I came to pay my respects for old time's sake," he admitted, his voice tight with unresolved emotions. Margaret's eyes searched his face for answers. "I noticed you weren't at the service," she said softly, the question implicit in her statement. He shifted on his feet, looking almost ashamed. "Not officially, no, it's complicated," he replied, glancing away. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, a nervous habit Margaret recognized from years of friendship. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant chirping of birds. Margaret waited, sensing that Danny had more to say. Finally, he took a deep breath before speaking. "I wasn't with him that night, Margaret. No one was. He went in alone and there was no record of an official dispatch." Danny's voice dropped lower, as if afraid of being overheard. "I've studied the case personally, gone over every report. There's nothing, no official order, no backup request. It's like he just vanished into thin air that night." Margaret's heart thudded heavily in her chest. She gripped the edges of her coat, fighting the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Danny continued, his words coming faster now. "When they found him, he was dead, lying in a pool of his own blood with a gun in his hand, pointed toward the body of the drug lord he took down. There were multiple gunshots, shell casings everywhere. It was chaos." Margaret's knees weakened, and Danny quickly reached out to steady her. "I'm sorry," he murmured, guiding her to sit on a nearby bench. "I shouldn't have dumped all this on you like that." She shook her head, grateful for his support. "No, I need to know. Please, Danny, tell me everything." Danny sat beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers in a comforting gesture. His brow furrowed as he continued, his voice laced with skepticism. "They said he acted without orders, went rogue. But I don't believe it. Tucker wouldn't have done something like that, not without a reason." He shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "It's just too convenient for them to paint him as a criminal. A black officer found at the scene, the perfect scapegoat to tie up a messy situation quickly." He looked at Margaret, his eyes intense, and lowered his voice even further. "But listen, these are just my suspicions. If you talk to anyone about this, my career could be on the line. Please, Margaret, keep this between us." The weight of what Danny was implying pressed down on Margaret, but she understood the risk he was taking just by sharing this with her. She nodded solemnly, feeling the gravity of his trust settle heavily in her heart. Danny's expression softened, a glimmer of the old friendship they had once shared shining through. "I'll ask around and see what I can find out, but I can't promise much. The case is closed, and nobody wants to open old wounds, but Tucker deserves the truth, and so do you." He paused, then added, "And Margaret, if you come across any new leads or information, no matter how small it might seem, please let me know. We're in this together, for Tucker's sake." Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, Danny." The sincerity in her voice was met with a small, sad smile from him. "I'll do what I can," he promised, his words carrying the weight of years of partnership and friendship with Tucker. He reached out and squeezed her hand once more. "We'll get to the bottom of this, I swear." Danny stood up, looking back at Tucker's grave. His voice caught slightly as he said, "Rest easy, old friend. We've got your back, just like always." Margaret rose to her feet, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. They walked together towards the parking lot, their shared silence heavy with both hope and uncertainty. As they reached the edge of the cemetery, they paused, facing each other. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," Danny said softly. "And remember, I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." Margaret nodded, managing a small smile. "You too, Danny, and thank you for coming here, for everything." They parted ways, Danny heading to his car while Margaret lingered. Her fingers brushed against the ruby earring in her bag, its weight a tangible reminder of the mysteries still unsolved. With a heavy sigh, Margaret gathered her belongings. She whispered her goodbyes to Tucker, pressing a kiss to the cold stone. "Thank you, my love, for guiding me toward the truth step by step. I'll come see you again tomorrow, I promise." As Margaret walked toward her car, a renewed sense of purpose surged within her. The truth about Tucker's death was buried beneath layers of official reports and convenient stories, waiting to be uncovered. Her thoughts turned to the girl she'd seen earlier. Did she hold a connection to the earrings? Margaret was convinced that solving these puzzles would lead to the real story behind Tucker's final moments. With determination set in her heart, she started the engine and drove home, prepared to confront whatever challenges awaited in her pursuit of justice. Margaret's mind was still reeling from the events at the cemetery as she pulled out onto the main road. Her eyes scanned the sidewalks, half hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious girl in the yellow dress. The streets were relatively quiet, the heat of the day keeping most people indoors. As she drove, Margaret's thoughts tumbled over each other like stones in a river. The earrings, the girl, Tucker's tarnished reputation. How did it all fit together? She was so lost in her musings that she almost missed it, a flash of yellow about a block ahead. Margaret's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the girl from the cemetery, but something was wrong. The child was struggling against an older woman on the sidewalk, her small frame twisting and turning in an attempt to break free. Without thinking, Margaret jerked the wheel, pulling her car over to the curb. She narrowly avoided an oncoming vehicle, the blare of its horn fading as she threw open her door and stepped out onto the scorching pavement. As she approached, the scene became clearer. The older woman had a firm grip on the girl's arm, her face contorted with anger. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, darting around frantically until they locked onto Margaret. "What's going on here?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The older woman's head shot up, her eyes narrowing as she assessed Margaret's head to toes. "This is none of your business, white lady," she spat. "That little thief of a daughter of mine stole my ruby earrings." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The earrings, the yellow dress girl. Of course. She felt the weight of them in her pocket, but something held her back from revealing their presence. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Perhaps I could give you both a ride home. It's scorching hot out here, and if the police saw you and your daughter fighting on the street like this—" The woman scowled, clearly unhappy with Margaret's intervention. "Get away, what do you care? We don't need your help," she growled. "White like salt you may seem, but you people need to stop acting like heroes. Mind your own business, Grandma." But the girl's eyes never left Margaret's face. There was a silent plea in them, a desperate hope that Margaret couldn't bring herself to ignore. "Please," Margaret said, addressing the woman but keeping her gaze on the child. "It's very hot out here. Let me drive you. It's no trouble." For a long moment the woman seemed to waver. Then, with a huff of irritation, she nodded curtly. "Fine. I can make use of a little air conditioning. We live on Broad Street, still a few miles down, but don't think this changes anything." The short drive to Broad Street passed in tense silence. Margaret's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she navigated the unfamiliar streets. In the rearview mirror, she could see the girl huddled against the door, as far from the woman as possible. Finally, they pulled up in front of a dilapidated house. The paint was peeling, and several windows were boarded up. Without a word, the woman yanked open the car door and pulled the girl out after her. They disappeared into the shadows of the porch, leaving Margaret alone in the car. As she sat there trying to process what had just happened, something caught her eye. There on the back seat where the girl had been sitting was another origami. With trembling hands, Margaret reached for it. The papercraft was folded identically to the one she'd found on her windshield at the cemetery, but when she opened it, her heart sank. It was empty. Margaret stared at the blank interior of the envelope, her mind racing. The emptiness felt significant somehow, as if it were a message in itself, a confirmation of the girl's connection to the earrings, perhaps. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, Margaret came to a decision. She wouldn't confront the woman now. Doing so would probably only bring more trouble for the girl. Instead, she resolved to return to the cemetery tomorrow. Perhaps she would find the girl there again if she wasn't too frightened by Obed's threats. The mysteries surrounding Tucker's death were still unresolved, but for the first time since the funeral, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "Tomorrow," she promised herself. Casting one last glance at the dilapidated house, she shifted her car into gear and pulled away from the curb. The sky had deepened to dark indigo as she drove along the road toward her home, the once warm and loving place she had shared with Tucker. The next morning, Margaret put on a purple dress that Tucker had always loved seeing her in. By the time she got into her car, the sun was just peeking over the horizon. When she arrived at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, the early morning light bathed the garden in a gentle golden glow. Margaret stepped out of her car, smoothing down her purple floral-patterned dress. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew and freshly cut grass. It was a striking difference from the stifling heat of the day before, as if nature itself was offering a moment of calm before what lay ahead. In one hand, she carried a bouquet of fresh roses, in the other, a thermos of coffee. Her movements were purposeful, driven by a determination that had settled over her during the long night. As she approached the cemetery gates, she saw a familiar figure. The caretaker, Obed, was just finishing unlocking the heavy iron gates. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, offering a nod of recognition. "Good morning, Mrs. Scott," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You're out early today." Margaret managed a small smile. "Good morning, Obed. Yes, I couldn't sleep much last night." Obed's eyes softened with understanding. "That's not uncommon, especially in the early days. Take all the time you need." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Obed, I was wondering, have you seen that little girl again? The one in the yellow dress?" The caretaker's brow furrowed as he shook his head. "Can't say that I have, Ma'am. I suspect she might be keeping her distance after yesterday's scare. If she's been around, she's been mighty good at hiding." He paused, then added, "You know, if she's local, she might be from over on Broad Street. It's known for folks who've fallen on hard times." Margaret nodded, filing away this piece of information. "Thank you, Obed. I appreciate your help." As she walked towards Tucker's grave, Margaret's mind was awash with thoughts and theories. The cool morning air seemed to sharpen her senses, making every detail of her surroundings stand out in vivid clarity. When she reached Tucker's final resting place, Margaret carefully placed the bouquet on the grass. With practiced movements, she unscrewed the cap of the thermos and poured a stream of coffee over the soil, a quiet offering to her late husband. "Oh, Tucker," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "So much has happened since yesterday. I wish you were here to help me make sense of it all." She began to recount the events of the previous day, the discovery of the earrings, the glimpse of the girl, the confrontation on the street. As she spoke, it was almost as if she could feel Tucker's presence, listening intently as he always had in life. "I don't know what to make of it all," Margaret admitted, "but I can't shake the feeling that this girl is somehow connected to you, to what happened on that last day. Am I chasing ghosts, Tucker, or are you trying to tell me something?" A rustle of leaves behind her made Margaret's heart skip a beat. She turned slowly, half expecting to see Obed making his rounds. Instead, her breath caught in her throat as she spotted the familiar small figure, half hidden behind a nearby tree. It was the girl, still wearing the same yellow dress. The hem was stained with dirt, and her legs were smudged with soil, suggesting she had spent the night outdoors. Her eyes were wide and wary, but there was a glimmer of recognition in them as she met Margaret's gaze. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the girl raised her hand and pointed up at the tree. Margaret's eyes followed the gesture, and she realized with a start that the upper branches showed signs of recent disturbance. "Have you been up there all night?" Margaret asked softly, her voice filled with concern. The girl nodded, her movements small and cautious. Margaret's heart ached at the thought of this child spending the night alone in a cemetery, hiding in a tree. Slowly, Margaret lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged on the grass beside Tucker's grave. She wanted to appear as non-threatening as possible. "My name is Margaret," she said gently. "What's yours?" The girl hesitated for a moment before answering in a voice that was soft and slightly hoarse, likely from disuse. "Mara." Margaret nodded, offering a warm smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mara. I've been hoping to talk to you." Carefully, she reached into her bag and pulled out the ruby earrings and the folded notes. "Can you tell me about these?" she asked, holding them out where Mara could see them. Mara's eyes darted to the earrings, widening slightly. She took a hesitant step out from behind the tree, her small hand reaching out, but pausing just short of touching them. "It's okay," Margaret reassured her. "I'm not angry, I just want to understand." The cemetery was quiet save for the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a mourning dove. Margaret waited patiently, her eyes fixed on Mara, who seemed to be gathering her courage. "Mara," Margaret said gently, "I've been looking for you. I think you might know something about my husband, Tucker Scott. Did you know him?" Mara nodded, her eyes darting between Margaret's face and the earrings in her hand. "I was looking for you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's heart quickened. "You were? Why?" Mara took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Your husband. He helped me," she began, her words coming out haltingly. She made a gesture with her fingers, forming the shape of a gun. "My father had a gun. Hurt Officer Tucker. Your husband took... bullet." Margaret felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her. Her knees weakened and she was grateful to already be sitting. "Tucker, he was shot protecting you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "He gave me this," she said, reaching into a pocket of her dirty dress. She pulled out a crumpled, worn photograph, and the earrings too. With trembling hands, Margaret accepted the picture. Her breath caught in her throat as she instantly recognized it. It was a photo of herself that Tucker had always carried in his wallet. She vividly remembered the day it was taken, how Tucker had insisted on capturing that moment, saying he wanted to always keep her smile close. Her gaze shifted to the earrings in her palm, and she recalled how he had kept them as a memento of their last wedding anniversary 6 months ago. That night had been a joyful celebration with their children, marked by her wearing that cherished ruby pair, a symbol of their enduring love, and the trials they had faced and overcome since he first gifted them to her in their first year of marriage. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, her heart simultaneously shattering and swelling with love and pride for her husband. "Oh, Tucker," she whispered, tracing her finger over his handwriting on the back of the photo. Mara continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "My father, he was confused and angry from drug. After your husband fell with blood, Dad. Shot himself." She struggled to form the sentences, her English broken, but she made a gesture of a gun pointing to her head, indicating her father's tragic end. Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. The story she'd been told about Tucker's death, about his alleged involvement in a crime, had all been a lie. He had died a hero protecting this child. "Mara," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, "can you tell me more, but only if that's okay with you? Anything you can remember would help." Mara nodded and took a deep breath. In a quiet, trembling voice, she began to recount the incident. She described how, when the police arrived, they found only the aftermath, Tucker lying lifeless on the ground with her father, the area strewn with signs of drugs and violence. Amid the chaos, Mara's mother, who had been entangled in the drug trade, was arrested, further compounding the confusion and turmoil of that day. As Mara spoke, Margaret's mind flashed back to the days following Tucker's death. She remembered Tucker's supervisor, Robert, visiting her. His words had been cold and clinical as he delivered the news that Tucker was implicated in the crime. The department had claimed Tucker was operating alone, without his usual partner and command from the department, and must have somehow been involved in the drug operation. Margaret's mind raced, piecing together the tragic series of events. Tucker had stumbled upon a domestic dispute involving drugs. He had tried to intervene, to protect Mara, and had paid the ultimate price. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, the circumstances had led the police to believe he was involved in the crime. The truth, Margaret now understood, was far more complicated and heartbreaking. "Oh, Tucker," Margaret whispered, her heart breaking anew. She turned back to Mara, who was watching her with wide, anxious eyes. "Mara, sweetie, you've been so brave. Thank you for telling me all of this." Mara nodded, a faint smile flickering across her face. He was a good man. Saved me. Mara, Margaret asked gently, the woman I saw you with yesterday, is she your mother? Mara shook her head vigorously. Aunt, she said, her voice filled with fear. Bad like parents, drugs. Margaret's heart ached for this child who had been through so much. She wrestled with the decision of what to do next. Should she take Mara to the authorities to clear Tucker's name? But that would only subject the girl to more trauma, forcing her to recount her story to skeptical police officers. As if sensing Margaret's internal conflict, Mara looked up at her with pleading eyes. May I stay with you? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Margaret felt a surge of protectiveness wash over her. This child, who Tucker had given his life to save, needed her now. And in helping Mara, perhaps she could honor Tucker's final heroic act. Margaret stood up slowly, her joints stiff from sitting on the hard ground for so long. She looked down at Mara, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The weight of the decision before her pressed heavily on Margaret's shoulders, but in her heart, she knew what she had to do. Wiping away the last of her tears, Margaret placed a gentle hand on Mara's small shoulder. You can stay with me, she said, her voice soft but firm. The words felt right as soon as they left her mouth. She knew that caring for Mara would honor Tucker's final act of bravery and kindness. Mara's tense posture visibly relaxed at Margaret's words, and a faint, hopeful smile appeared on her face. It was the first real smile Margaret had seen from the girl, and it warmed her heart to see it. But that means we need to involve child services, okay? Margaret continued, kneeling down to be at eye level with Mara. And we'll have to talk to the police. This might lead to reopening the investigation into what happened to Tucker, but I promise I'll be with you every step of the way. I'll protect you, Mara. Fear flashed in Mara's eyes. Police bad, they take Mama. They say bad things about your husband. Margaret reached out, gently taking Mara's small hand in hers. I know you're scared, sweetheart, but there are good police officers too. We need to find them and tell them what really happened. It's what Tucker would have wanted. Mara seemed to consider this, her brow furrowed in thought. Will they take me away? She asked in a small voice. Margaret's heart clenched at the fear in Mara's voice. I won't let that happen, she said firmly. I promise I'll protect you. We'll do this together, okay? Margaret felt a surge of determination. She knew now that she had to clear Tucker's name, to make sure the world knew of his final, heroic act. But she also knew that she had a responsibility to the child sitting before her, this innocent caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes. Mara nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her small frame. My real name, she whispered, her voice barely audible, is Zara. What do you mean, your real name? Margaret asked gently. Aunt changed it when she took me, Zara explained, her voice growing slightly stronger. Said Mara was better. But I'm Zara. There was a quiet defiance in her voice, as if reclaiming her true name gave her strength. Margaret nodded, understanding flooding her heart. Zara, she repeated softly. It's a beautiful name. The girl's eyes brightened at hearing her real name spoken with such kindness. Margaret smiled warmly. Well then, Zara it is, and you know what? You can call me Maggie if you'd like. That's what Tucker always called me. Zara's smile grew a little wider at that, and she nodded again. As they stood there, the morning sun warming their faces, Margaret felt Tucker's presence more strongly than ever. It was as if he was there with them, approving of their newfound connection. Margaret realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would be dedicated to uncovering the truth and protecting the innocent, just as Tucker had done. With renewed purpose, Margaret stood, still holding Mara's hand. Come on, sweetheart, let's go say goodbye to Tucker for now, she said gently. We'll get you cleaned up and something to eat. Then we have some important people to talk to. They approached the grave together, and Margaret knelt once more beside the headstone. I know the truth now, my love, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You were a hero right to the very end. I always knew it. She poured the last of the coffee from her thermos over the soil, a final gesture of connection and farewell. As she did so, Zara stepped forward and placed her small hand on the gravestone. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice stronger and more confident than before. Margaret watched, tears in her eyes as Zara acknowledged the man who had saved her life. At that moment, she knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. They walked hand in hand toward the cemetery gates, the grounds bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun. Margaret felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before Tucker's death. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew. There would be difficult conversations with the police, with child services, and with her own children who had believed the worst of their father. But as they left Holy Sepulchre Cemetery together, Margaret felt ready to face whatever came next. She had the truth on her side now, and a mission to fulfill, to clear Tucker's name, and to give Zara the loving home she deserved.